first, Paul, just want to talk a little bit about storytelling and the importance of storytelling. So let's rewind. Why is storytelling important, most especially from an organizational leadership perspective, before we get to the specifics of the different types of stories?
Yeah, so there are a lot of reasons, as you can imagine, but I think the most important one is that human beings don't make decisions the way that we'd like to think we do. I think we all would like to think of ourselves as these very rational, logical decision makers. And sometimes we are, but it turns out the research shows that most of the time we're not. Yeah, it turns out that most of the time, most of our decisions are made in a subconscious emotional processing part of our brain. And then we justify and rationalize that decision a few nanoseconds later in a more conscious thinking, rational processing part of the brain. So it turns out, our subconscious emotional brain really makes our decisions for us. And then the rest of our brain is just trying to catch up. So if you want to influence what people think and feel and do, it turns out you need to talk to both parts of the brain. And storytelling is just uniquely well qualified to do that. Whereas most of our leadership communications techniques are not. They only speak to the rational thinking part of the brain. So when we as leaders, set a clear direction for the organization, or show somebody exactly how you want the job to be done, or be very clear in our message track. Those are all very important things, but know that you're speaking to half the brain when you do that. And storytelling is just, like I said, uniquely well qualified to reach that other part of the brain where most of our decisions are actually made.
So, Paul, why is it, if storytelling has been part of us for as long as humans have been able to communicate, even writing, drawing on cave walls, why is it that we aren't that good at storytelling, especially in the work environment?
Yeah. There's an irony there, because I think as kids, we're great at it. It's kind of like art. Every kid, when they draw their picture of the school bus or whatever and bring it home and put it on the refrigerator, they're a fabulous artist. But then we grow up and we decide that we're not, or we're too embarrassed to show our art. And it's kind of similar with storytelling. I think storytelling does come naturally to humans, but at work, we've been trained to not do it. Like when, the 20 years I spent at Procter & Gamble, we were taught to write a very effective, efficient, pithy one-page memo, right? And it's, here's my recommendation, and here are the 5 reasons why I think you should approve my recommendation. One page, no more, no stories, right? Just the facts, ma'am. And so I think we're all just trained to not do that at work, because, well, that's just, that's fun stuff. That's for fiction. That's for movies and novels, and that's for kids, and that's for story time in kindergarten. But at work, I'm going to be really serious, and all my communication is going to be very clear, focused, and direct, which is not what storytelling is, or not what most people think of as storytelling. So I think we're trained out of it, especially with the advent of the credentialization of business. People are running around all over DC with MBAs, and so we've professionalized the business world so much that we drove storytelling out of it. And I think people are just in the last couple of decades realizing the value of bringing it back in.
Yeah, and that storytelling is really important. Now, I love the hero's journey, especially for organizational branding, but it's very hard for leaders to learn and understand Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and be able to tell stories using that. So if storytelling is important, hero's journey is very complex for leadership storytelling. Again, there is a lot of value I see in it in organizational branding communications. So how can we tell effective stories?
Yeah. So, well, let me do this. Let me back up, because and sorry, I missed your prompt earlier. I thought you were going to ask another question. I think what we agreed to do is let me share a little bit about what kind of stories people should be telling first, and then let's get to how to do it. And the reason that order is important is because most people think all they need to know is, how do I tell better stories? And then I'll be a better storyteller. And that can certainly help. But in my working with executives, what I found is the biggest problem is that they don't know what stories to tell. And they don't know how to tell them. But if you know, even if you know how to tell a great story, if you don't know what stories you need to tell, it really doesn't matter how well you tell them, because you're telling the wrong stories. So most people ask the wrong question, or at least the wrong first question. They should be asking themselves, what stories do I need to tell? So let me just at least go through what I think are the most important 10 stories for people to tell, and then ask me that exact same question again, because structure and the Joseph Campbell hero's journey story that's a very important second question to ask. So let's do it in that order.
Great.
So there are dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of types of stories that you should probably be telling as a leader throughout the course of your career. But if you're just starting with it, I tried to collect, the most important 10, the 10 most important stories to start with. And the first 4 go together because they're about setting the direction for the organization. So those are, first of all, where we came from. So that's a founding story. Why we can't stay there. So that's a case for change story. Where we're going, which is a vision story, and how we're going to get there, which is a strategy story, because a strategy is about how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. All right. So the next 4 go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So that's what we believe. So that's a corporate values story. Who we serve. So that's a customer story, a story about the customer, so that everybody you work with can have a personal, human, visceral understanding of who the ultimate boss is. All right. What we do for those customers. So that's kind of a classical sales story, right? It's a story about what you do that's so awesome, people should pay you a lot of money to do it. And the number 8 is how we're different from our competitors. So I call that a marketing story, just because it's typically the marketing department's job to differentiate you from your competitors. But notice that just because I just mentioned a sales story and a marketing story doesn't mean that these are just stories for people to tell if they work in sales or marketing. Just like the strategy story isn't just for people to tell who work in the strategy department. These are stories that I think that every leader of every functional discipline needs to be able to tell in an organization. Now, if you work in marketing, you better have lots of marketing stories. If you work in sales, you better have lots of sales stories. But if you work in engineering or human resources or IT or any other department, you better have at least one good marketing story and one good sales story. Otherwise, you really don't know what your company's doing for people, right? Now, if you're keeping track, I think there are 2 left, right? Number 9 and 10. So 9 is why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. Everybody needs to have one of those, probably several. Number 10 is why you should want to work here. Now, not you, but you, whoever you're talking to, right? So that's a recruiting story. And again, you should have at least one of those, even if you don't work in the recruiting department, because every leader's job is attracting talent into the organization and having them stay and follow your leadership. So those last 2, get people to come to your organization and have them understand your leadership philosophy and style so that they can appreciate your leadership and understand what to expect from you. Now, again, there are lots more leadership stories you should tell, but if you're looking for a place to start, it's probably those 10.
And I can't wait to drill down on some of those that I've seen leaders have the greatest challenge with, Paul. Before we get there, though, so you mentioned, we talked about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and storytelling. These are the 10 stories we need to be able to tell. So we need to have at least one of each one of these as a leader to be able to tell. What is the structure of the stories that we should tell before then we drill down on a couple of these areas?
Yeah. So, and I'm glad you mentioned Joseph Campbell's the hero's journey storytelling structure, because a lot of leaders have heard of that, right? It's been, it's used in Hollywood, right and left, most of the movies you watch, you can diagnose it into those parts. And so a lot of leaders have heard of that, and some of them have studied it. And so they think that their leadership stories need to follow the same pattern. And I don't think they do. And the main reason is because if you really look at Joseph Campbell's hero's journey storytelling structure, there are 17 parts of the plot structure, right? The rise and the call to the action and the return and these leadership stories that you tell at work, they need to be like 2, 3, 4 minutes long. That's it. Now if you're writing your first screenplay or a novel, knock yourself out with the hero's journey storytelling structure. But if you're trying to tell pithy, leadership stories at work, I just personally find it too complex to execute and too complex to teach. So, I personally prefer something shorter than that. And I started out with, my very first book, just with a 3-step process: context, action, result. And the feedback that I got after doing that for several years is, that's good, but what goes in the context, and what goes in the action, and what goes in the result? So I felt like the leaders I was coaching needed a little bit more than that. Now, they didn't want 17 steps, but just in the plot, and then there's more for the whole thing. They wanted a little bit more than 3. So where I've settled is, there are 8 questions that your story needs to answer, and in a particular order, that I think will deliver the best result. And here are those 8 questions. So first of all, why should I bother listening to your story? Right. And so you've got to answer that question up front, or your audience may not listen to the story. So that's your hook to get them interested in listening to you for the next 2 to 3 minutes. Right. Once you've answered that question adequately.
Paul, can I want to understand each one a tiny bit before we go through them. So why should I listen to this story? How can that be done well? So it's not a restatement of this is important because.
Right. Yeah. So it's really just 1 or 2 sentences that lets the audience know that if they'll listen to you for the next few minutes, they're going to hear something that's important to them, not to you, but to them. So for example, if I was your boss and you came to me with a problem and you just told me about your problem, I could respond by saying, well, look, Mahan, here's what you got to do. You got to do these 2 things. Do this, do this, do this, and then that's going to work for you. Or I could say something like this. That's a tough problem. Let me tell you what I did 5 years ago when I had your job and I ran into the same problem. Okay. Now, I haven't told you the story yet, but I've just told you I had your job 5 years ago and I ran into the exact same problem. Let me tell you what I did about it. Now, you have no idea yet whether I succeeded in solving the problem or what I did was a dismal failure. And it doesn't matter, because you're going to learn something important either way. You can either learn how to do it, or you're going to learn what to avoid doing it, right? So that 1 or 2 sentences lets you know that you're about to hear something that's important to the problem that you're having right now. So you want to listen to my story. And that's all the hook is supposed to do, is to get you to want to listen to the story. You don't know anything about how the story is going to end, or the lesson you learned, or whether it's successful or failure. You'll learn that in the story. But that's one way to do it, is just to let them know this is going to be important to you without telling them that. But that's the best technique.
Yeah, Debbie says, why should I bother listening to your story? What's in it for me?
What's in it for me? Exactly. What's in it for me? Because if you don't answer that question, they might not listen to your story. So that's why it's important. Now, notice you haven't told the story yet. So that's the question you answer before you tell the story. So once you've done that, you've gotten their attention. You've kind of earned the right to answer the next 5 questions. All right. So that's where and when did it take place? And we can go into detail in a minute, but let me give the next 5. So where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity that they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? Right? And that should sound like the natural flow of a story, because of course it is the natural flow of a story. But if you're keeping track again, there's 2 left. So what did you learn from the story? And what do you think I should go do now? I, the person listening to the story. So those last 2 are your opportunity to make sure to draw a conclusion and make a recommended action, because you're telling these stories as a leader for a purpose, right? To drive some kind of behavior change. So the first question is to get their attention. The next 5 questions are actually telling the story. The last 2 questions are to draw a conclusion and recommend some action. So those 5 questions replace the Joseph Campbell 17-step hero's journey storytelling structure, but you still need to get their attention and conduct some business at the end of it. So I think all 8 are important, but that's the proper order, I think. So that's the structure of a business story at work.
Yeah. So in thinking through that structure, again, as you mentioned, in the first part, you are connecting rather than jumping into the storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
There are 5 steps in the storytelling that doesn't necessarily need to be about you. So that's where I would love to get an example or 2 that doesn't necessarily need to be about you. This is what I experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And then a call to action at the end of that storytelling.
Yeah. So, well, let me give you an example, and then you'll see. So Number 9 in that list of 10 is why I lead the way I do. All right. So that's a story. That's typically is a story about you that you would tell, but it doesn't have to be. It can still be a great leadership story that people can learn a leadership lesson from. So, for example, my favorite example of that comes from a guy named Mike. And Mike was, he went to West Point. So he was a military guy. So his very first leadership opportunity was in the military. In fact, the very first experience was on a training exercise out in California, on an Army base on a 10-mile long, 5-mile wide training field for tanks, right? So he was a tank platoon leader, and they were going to go into a simulated battle the next day with 400 tanks on one side of the field and 400 tanks on the other side of the field. And Mike got assigned to be the leader of the first tank going into battle on his side of the field with 399 other tanks in wedge formation behind him. Right now, since he was the leader of the first tank, of course, the night before the exercise, he sits down with the commanding officer and they look at a map of the terrain, figure out where the high ground is, so they have the best odds of winning the exercise. Well, the next morning, the exercise starts. He's in the tank. They're racing out onto the field. He gets 2 or 3 minutes in, and he's got to make his very first leadership decision. Do I turn left or do I turn right? And the truth is, he just has no idea what to do. I mean, apparently, a battlefield. And by the way, obviously they're not shooting live ordnances at each other. They're in real tanks on a real field, but they've got little laser pointers attached to their gun turrets. So, nobody's going to get hurt. But they have to drive the thing and navigate around. And he gets to a place where he's got to turn left or right, and he just doesn't know. Because apparently a battlefield looks different when you're looking at it through the crack in the hatch of a tank. It's bouncing up and down at 40 miles an hour than it does on the map in the conference room. So here's his choice. So he's got 2 options. One, he could stop the tank, turn the light on, get the map out, figure out the right thing to do, which might take, 30 seconds. Option 2 is he could just guess. Well, Mike chose option 2. He yells out, driver, turn left. So the driver turns left. Well, a few seconds later, the light in his tank starts flashing, which means you just got shot by a laser. You're dead, technically. So, okay, those guys have to stop the tank, pop the hatch, get out. They're done for the day. Well, a few seconds later, tank number 2 turns left right behind them because that's their job, follow the leader. Well, their light starts flashing. They're done. Tank number 3 turns left right behind them, and their light starts flashing. But the guys in tank number 4 just saw 3 tanks turn left and get virtually shot and killed. They realized that was a mistake. So tank number 4 turned right. And then 396 other tanks turned right. They took the high ground and won the exercise. Now, Mike made a mistake that day. His very first leadership opportunity, and he blew it. Okay, turned left when he should have turned right. But he learned a valuable lesson from that, and that is this: that sometimes it's better to make the wrong decision quickly than to make the right decision slowly. Right? Just imagine what would have happened if he had chosen option 1. Stopped the tank, turned the light on, got the map out, spent 30 seconds figuring out the right thing to do. There would have been 400 tanks lined up getting picked off one at a time. He was better off making a quick decision, even though it was wrong, than making the right decision slowly. And war and business and life are all similar in that, if you make a mistake, usually it'll become apparent before long, right? Things will start going badly and you'll recognize that was a mistake and you can monitor and adjust. Now, that doesn't mean you should always just shoot from the hip and never take your time and make, an educated decision. But we often get stuck in analysis paralysis in the business world where we spend 6 months studying a decision. Meanwhile, our competition is still moving forward. So sometimes it's better to make the wrong decision quicker. And that's what Mike learned. And that has changed who he is as a leader. He is now a much more decisive leader, and he expects the people who work for him to be more decisive leaders as long as they learn from their mistakes. Now, he can tell that to people to help them understand what kind of leadership to expect from him. But anybody can tell that story, just like I told it to you. That's not me. I wasn't the guy in the tank. Like, I've never been in the Army. But I can tell you that story and teach you a great leadership lesson, even though it's not about me. And most of the stories that you tell should not be about you. All right. But and here's the reason why. What would you think about the man or woman leader whose every story they tell is about themselves? Mahan, what would you think about that person?
They're very self-centered.
Exactly. And that's not the kind of leader you want to be. So most of your stories should be about other people.
Yeah, so Paul, I love that story because it also shows the need for us to either have stories or, in cases, reflect on personal experiences that relate to how we want to communicate what we prioritize as leaders, why we lead the way we do. One of the challenges I see with the executives that I work with is, first of all, in some instances, they say, I don't want to make this all about myself, which I agree. To your point, you don't have to make this about yourself, but not telling stories is not a good strategy. You can make
Right.
it about other people. You can tell stories about you having made the wrong decision, which is also a great way to make the point. But not sharing it is not part of leadership. So
Right.
sometimes the leaders want to say, I don't want to focus on myself, but that is not great leadership. You have to think through, why do I lead the way I do? And what are a few stories I can tell in expressing why I lead the way I do?
Right. Yeah. And I love two of the things that you just said. So let me highlight them. Well, first of all, why I lead the way I do is only one type of leadership story. I just gave you 10, and that's only one, and there are dozens more. So it is more common for the why I lead the way I do stories to be about you. But most of the other 9, they're not going to mostly be about you. So of all the stories that you tell, most of them should be about other people. And the thing that I really liked about what you said is, when you do tell a story about you, frequently it should be a failure story, right? Again, if half the stories you tell are about other people, but the half you tell about yourself, they're all your success stories, you still might come across as that kind of self-centered leader that you don't want to come across as. So of the ones you tell about yourself, some should be like the one I just told you, where, hey, I made a mistake. Let me tell you about that, but let me tell you about the lesson that I learned from it, because people want to work for the kind of magnanimous leader, selfless leader, who's willing to share their own mistakes so that you don't have to make them, right? We'd rather work for that kind of leader. So two things. One is, yes, you need to be collecting stories from other people, which means you need to be listening for stories from other people, and you need to be noticing interesting things that happen in your work life to other people that you might tell a story about, right? Anytime somebody learns an important lesson, there's a story there that's about to be born or lost forever, and it's your choice which it's going to be.
And I have to tell you, Paul, so for my podcast on Thursdays, it's with authors like yourself. On Tuesdays, it's with leadership. It's with leaders of in the Greater Washington region. And 2 of the episodes that came out almost a year and a half, 2 years ago, one with Marty Rogers of Accenture, and one with Linda Rabbit of Rand Construction, to this day get lots and lots of downloads all around the world. These are people that are forwarding it to others, and they do a beautiful job of exactly that, telling the story. In a couple of instances, stories of their own failures or their own setbacks, and in a couple of instances, stories of why they have the values that they have. So you can visualize it and relate to it. And people love it, and they share it with other people to listen to, as opposed to if Marty, for example, in one of the stories, he talks about the importance of respect that he learned from his father. I'm not going to give away the story, but if someone says, I learned from my dad that I need to respect others, it's like, okay, good for you, right? I mean, it's not, there's nothing special about it. But when you listen to the story, it's a powerful story. So I think that's part of the importance for us to realize that we also connect very well with people who have intentionally thought through and practice the stories that they want to tell to express why they lead the way they do.
Right. Yeah. And that's the whole purpose of like starting out with this list of 10. It's to get people to realize, oh, I should be telling stories in a lot more situations, leadership situations, than I thought. And there are a lot more types of leadership stories that I had imagined. So, instead of just thinking, well, I need 2 or 3 leadership stories, like, because people make this one mistake a lot in our business, and I want to tell people a story about that. Yeah, that's great. But do you have a strategy story? Well, you probably have a strategy. Do you have a strategy story to go with it? You probably have a vision for your department. Do you have a vision story to go with it? Probably not. So So just opening people's mind to, there are a lot of different types of stories as a leader that I probably should have that I don't have. And once you've had your mind open to that, all of a sudden you start seeing stories everywhere and adding them to your repertoire and filling out your kind of wish list of stories that you want to have.
So Paul, Maria asks, what would be your approach to addressing the what's in it for me when you are sharing a story with a large, diverse audience? Because the interests are varied, right?
Yeah. So you're going to have to find some reason why your audience would want to listen to it, right? If the audience is so diverse that half of them are just not going to care about your story, maybe you need to find a different story. So that's always a possibility. But another way to do it is just about any story you tell or anything that happens in the business world happens for a reason. Somebody's trying to change something for the benefit of someone or something else. We're going to make this change to our product because it's going to be better for the consumer, or it's going to be better for the retailer, or it's going to be better for our employees, or it's going to be better for our shareholders, or it's going to be better for the environment. Or like changes always happen for intentional change happens for a reason. It's to benefit someone or something. And so if you can figure out what that someone or something is, then relate the story to that person or thing. And because human beings tend to care about other human beings, right? So even if I'm not the consumer who's going to benefit from this change you're making to your product, if you're making the change to benefit your employees so that they get fewer injuries, so that they don't have to work as hard, so that they, whatever it is, well, I care about people. So if you tell me a story about how this is going to save your employees from, reduce injuries on the job by 10%, even though I'm not an employee at your company, well, that sounds good. I want that to happen. I'm not a jerk, right? Yeah, I'm interested in hearing that because it's going to help some other human being. So, but you need to figure out who stands to benefit from the thing that I'm about to tell you about, and make sure the audience recognizes that there is a real human benefit to this thing that I'm about to tell you about. And then they'll be interested, even if they're not that person. Now, it's better if they're that person, but if not, relate it to a real human being who will benefit, because most of us care about other human beings.
Yeah, and one way to think about it, by the way, Maria, you are virtually unstoppable, and your class is. One other way to think about it is there is a reason in this very distracted world, even when there are work conferences and now some are starting, why someone chooses to be in that audience. There is a purpose for that session. There is a purpose why they're there. There is a title to the talk, or there is a title to the panel, or whatever you're there. Therefore, there is a commonality. Doesn't matter how diverse the group is. Diverse can be geographically, socioeconomic background, all of those things. But there is a commonality. There is a common interest that has caused them to be there to listen to you. Or there is a common interest to people that will that are watching this right now or will watch it later, right? Because it's about storytelling. So I think understanding and thinking about that common interest and thinking about what is a story I can tell that connects to that common interest can be part of what you are looking for. Don't let the diversity on the surface sort of distract from the fact that there is a commonality in why people are paying attention to you at that moment in time.
Yeah, agree.
So Stephanie also asks, how about your digital story versus verbal story? Should digital story be the same as the verbal one?
So can I assume digital just means something online, or
I believe so. And Stephanie, feel free to clarify. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So most of the techniques that I teach people about storytelling are vehicle agnostic, meaning it doesn't matter whether it's for a story you tell verbally or in writing, in an email, in a blog, in a video, in an audio format. So those 8 questions that I mentioned, exactly the same structure that you would use if it's something on a website versus something you tell on stage in front of an audience or in your office in a conversation or on the phone. So those things are the same. The techniques to create the right emotional engagement, the techniques to create a surprise ending, which, by the way, are also things you need to get good at as a storyteller. All those are the same. The things that will differ is when you're writing a memo or writing a blog post, people tend to write slightly differently than they speak. And that often makes stories sound terrible, because it ends up sounding like something that you wrote instead of something that you were going to tell somebody. And so part of my advice is you should write the way that you'd like to speak when you're speaking at your best. So your stories, even when you write them, should sound conversational. Now, when you get to the rest of the memo where you're just laying out your thoughts and whatever, fine, just get very formal with it. But when you get to the storytelling part, it should sound conversational and extemporaneous. So most of the techniques are vehicle agnostic, and you want them to sound the same. The other difference, though, is length, especially if when you mean digital, you mean things like, on Twitter. Okay, so you used to have only 120 characters. Now I think they've upped it to 240 or something. But that's not a lot of words. Okay, I mean, that's not a lot of words. So your story might need to be shorter, but you still kind of need to answer all of the 8 questions. So it just needs to be pithier. And the way to do that is not to just start deleting things from the story to make randomly or get rid of the things you think are the least important. The way I suggested is write down the 8 questions and just put bullet point, answer the 8 questions just on a piece of paper. And then you can go delete things, but don't delete everything in your answer to any one particular question, because then you have an incomplete story. Better to delete a little bit of things from each of the questions than delete everything from one question, because at least that way that leaves you with a complete story. And I've even seen, some really short stories. I think might have been Ernest Hemingway who was challenged to write a story in 6 words or less. And he did it, of course. And I'll tell you what it is. It's for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Okay. Now that'll probably wipe the smile off your faces when that starts to sink in, right? Because that's a very sad story, right? Obviously, a couple has lost a child and they'd already bought their first set of baby clothes and now they're selling them. But those 6 words accomplished, all the things in my questions. I mean, you know exactly what happened, where it happened, why it happened, the emotional reaction of the parent, like it all. So you can do it. You can write short stories. It's just a little bit more difficult, and ironically, takes more time than writing a long story.
It's very hard, but again, the first step of it is to think through, as you mentioned, Paul, those 8 steps and try to answer them in coming up with these stories. Now, again, I am a big advocate for it. I think almost all of us, including me, are not as good at it as we should be. Now, the areas that you mentioned, the types of stories that I see the biggest difficulty with, one of them is why I lead the way I do. A lot of leaders that I've interacted with have a very hard time with that. Another one is the why we can't stay there. And I think in all kinds of organizations, including at my beloved LGW, we have a tough time with that, in that we want to recognize and celebrate how great we are doing, right? A lot of the leaders that I work with want to communicate that and have a hard time with why we can't stay there, to present it in a way where it's not the burning platform, which terrifies people and in many instances is not true, but is cause for shifting and a move. So how can leaders tell the better stories on why we can't stay there to initiate movement toward a strategy, growth, bigger impact, better things?
Yeah. So that's one where you're telling the entire story is about that someone or something that the change you want to make will benefit. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier in my answer to your question about how can you make the hook stronger with a diverse audience. Here's a case where in the why, we can't stay here, the case for change, the entire story is about the someone or the something who stands to benefit from the change that you're recommending, right? So the example in the book is about a pharmaceutical company. And so instead of, and I think the example was about them needing to reduce the length of time on their drug development process. It takes like 15 years to get a drug from idea to market. And they wanted to get that down to 5 years. And that was going to have these, huge benefit to the, profitability of the company and, improve the stock price, and everybody's going to get bigger bonuses and all that. And they could have just told people that's why we're doing it. But that somehow didn't motivate the rank and file, probably because they didn't have a lot of stock, and stock options and big bonuses, and, weren't big shareholders.
So,
So
Paul, let me jump in. I want to underline, because that's a big challenge I see. One is that it's not, if we don't do this product, there is a negative, right? Our competition has other better products, or we're going to lose in the marketplace. That is not the way to sell change and that future. But it's also not presenting a positive, the stock price or whatever else, that doesn't relate as well to your listeners. So you are selling the story to your listeners. So thank you. I just wanted to underline that, because I see two challenges. One is not selling it to the listeners. The second one is a desire to talk about the potential negatives, and that by itself terrifies people and doesn't bring about change either.
Yeah. So the way they were originally selling this idea had the first problem, but not the second problem. So they were selling the wrong benefit. They were selling the benefit of improved profitability and share price and return on investment to a bunch of lower level rank and file employees who it wouldn't make a big difference to. But they were selling a positive. They weren't selling, avoiding a negative. It was positive, but it was just the wrong audience. That they didn't stand to benefit financially that much, but the senior executives did, but the lower level employees didn't. So this is one of my clients. So when I, they brought me in to help them with the story. So we threw that story out completely, and we figured out, well, who really is going to, other than senior executives, who else is going to benefit from the change of getting products to market sooner? And the answer was, well, it's not our customers. Our customers are doctors and hospitals. They buy the drugs that we make. Who's really going to benefit? Well, the people to whom they're prescribing those drugs, the patients. And so we ended up telling a story about a woman whose son had cancer, and was dying of cancer. And she was desperately trying to get him cured, and the doctors couldn't cure it. And it turned out that the one company, it wasn't even the company that had hired me, it was one of their competitors, had come up with a new cancer treatment drug that would treat the specific cancer this young boy had, but it hadn't been through the FDA approval process yet, so he couldn't get it yet. And he ended up dying like weeks before it was approved by the FDA. And so the story became, that kid, he is why we want to get our products to market sooner, is to save more people's lives, not so that we can put more money in our pocket. It's for kids like that. And that became something that everybody cared about, up and down the chain. So the whole story was about this kid and his mother's fight to get him this drug before it was approved by the FDA. And notice there that this story wasn't even about the pharmaceutical company who'd hired me. It was about one of their competitors. But yet that story became their story inside the company to sell this huge change to get from 15 down to 5, even though it wasn't about them. It was about somebody else. But they knew that, well, the same thing is going to happen with us, with our drugs, and we can save other kids. That's just a concrete example of that happening.
That's an outstanding example, again, of that impact. And I know a lot of people involved in Leadership Greater Washington care about that impact, but without the kind of storytelling that you talk about, the organizations cannot align everyone and get everyone energized for that impact. The storytelling is what adds value to it. Now, the other thing I wonder, Paul, is there are times when I hear stories and they are memorable and they connect emotionally, out of the 10 that you mentioned. And there are times when they aren't as memorable. So what can we do to make the stories more memorable and more impactful within these 10 stories that as leaders we need to be able to tell?
Yeah. So great question. The thing that makes stories memorable is an element of something unexpected, a surprise. Okay, and that it works for a very physiological reason. So when somebody is surprised or shocked, the body releases a little bit of adrenaline in your system. Excuse me, in your system, which is why when something surprising happens, you get kind of jittery and you're on edge, and the whole fight or flight thing kicks in, right? Well, it turns out that adrenaline also has another, so it gets you hopped up and ready to fight or flee, but it also improves the memory consolidation process. So that's the process that's what psychologists call it. It's the process by which something gets consolidated or renders in your brain into forming a solid memory, right? And it usually takes a few seconds to a few minutes to a few hours after something happens before it's like really kind of solidified in memory. And during that period of time, if there's some adrenaline in your system, that process is faster and more efficient. So you literally will remember, which is why you remember things that happened to you when you got shocked or surprised. You'll remember it forever, right? That is the reason why. So in order to make your story more memorable, you just need something surprising in it. And it turns out there are very simple techniques to create surprises in stories, even where there's nothing naturally in that story that might seem surprising. So I'll just give you an example. Here, that's the simplest technique. So there's a young boy named James, 9-year-old kid. He's in the kitchen with his mom and his mom's sister. Now, while mom and auntie are at the kitchen table having a cup of tea, James is at the stove watching the tea kettle boil. And he's just fascinated with it, right? He's watching the jet of steam come out of the tea kettle, and he's got a spoon. He holds it up there into the jet of steam and watches his little drops of water condense on it, trickle down the spoon and drip into a cup he's got sitting there so it doesn't make a mess in his mom's kitchen. Anyway, just watching this cycle go over and over and over again, just fascinated with it. Well, eventually his mother just gets frustrated with him and she kind of barks at him. She's like, James, like, go read a book, ride your bike, go outside and play, do your homework. Like, aren't you ashamed of yourself just wasting your time? You're literally staring at the tea kettle boiling, like, for crying out loud. Well, fortunately, he was undaunted by that admonition, because 20 years later, at the age of 29, and in the year 1765, James Watt reinvented the steam engine, ushering in the Industrial Revolution that we, of course, all benefit from today, and all based on that fascination with steam that he developed at the age of 9 in his mother's kitchen. Now, the first time I read that story was in a book titled James Watt, right? It was a biography of the guy who invented the steam engine. So to me, of course, it was no surprise at all that the story in chapter 1 about that 9-year-old boy named James, it was no surprise that was about the guy who would grow up to invent the steam engine. I was reading a book on his life, right? But to you and your audience members, unless you read that part of my book, that was probably a surprise, unless you're a history buff maybe. And the reason it was a surprise is very simple, because I didn't tell you his last name and the year. So there's the technique. Take one or two vital but small pieces of information that belong at the beginning of the story and don't give them to your audience until the end of the story. Presto, surprise ending. So notice I didn't skip an entire question. So question number 2 is, where and when did it happen, right? I told you where it happened, mom's kitchen, but I didn't tell you when. Okay. Question 3 is, who's the main character? Well, I told you his first name, James. I didn't tell you his last name. So I answered the questions partially, but I didn't fully answer the question, which sets up an element of the unknown so that I can surprise you by finishing answering the question at the end. And that technique just creates a natural surprise at the end of the story. I mean, in fact, the best way to execute this in a leadership story is, imagine you've just told somebody, maybe you told them the story about the guy in the tank, and maybe that was you, right? But you didn't tell them, hey, this is what happened when I was in the Army. You just said, hey, well, there's this guy, when I was in the Army, there was this guy who was in a tank exercise, and you tell the whole story. And at the end of the story, you say, by the way, that guy who turned left instead of right, that was me. And I will never make that mistake again, whatever, but, because, and the people who work with me won't make that mistake either, because they will have all heard my story. So, that's a way to end a story that's much more surprising, much more memorable than one where it's told the normal way.
And that's outstanding. So we need to answer those 8 questions by the time we've told the story, but we don't necessarily need to complete every question. and the ability to keep some to the end makes it more surprising, therefore much more likely to be memorable and impactful, because there are physiological reasons. The other thing is, Paul, and I don't think you had a chance to address this, is that even in brain scans, first of all, when people are told stories, there are different brain scans and different parts of the brain that get activated. So this is physiological for us as humans. This is not just something that, you know, is a choice. Physiologically, parts of our brain light up when we hear stories. And then to your point, when there is surprise, there are additional physiological elements that get involved. That's why there are some messages that we end up remembering and resonate with us, and some we don't. We might not know the physiology of it or the reasons for it. You have broken down the reasons for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So, Paul, the other thing a lot of organizations, including at times, I think at whether LGW, or I was at a conversation with a client yesterday, where they understand the value of stories. They also understand the value of being able to tell stories of their clients,
Hmm.
but they wonder about how can we capture stories and retell stories. What are some best practices you would recommend or you have seen in organizations being able to capture, share stories?
Yeah, that's a great question, because if you intentionally go about trying to capture stories, you'll have better luck, documenting and having lots of stories at your fingertips to tell, right? So some of the more creative techniques are, some of my clients will have once a month, they'll have a story session, right? Well, they'll bring in 15, 20 employees into a room, order pizza for lunch. And the only thing you're allowed to do for that hour is eat pizza and tell stories. And somebody's assigned to be the scribe, or they're videotaping it or whatever. And you're just supposed to share stories. Some of my other clients will have in each of their departments, their weekly department meetings, there's 5 minutes of every department meeting that's dedicated to sharing a story, not a bunch of stories, just one story. And each week a new person is identified as being the person to have to share a story that week. And ahead of time, like, this week is my week, next week is your week, whatever. So everybody knows when it's their week, and they've got a whole year, maybe to, that's probably a big department, but you've got a few weeks to know, I need to come to share a good story that day. And by the end of the year, you got 52 great new stories that everybody can put in their own repertoire of stories to share. So intentional ways like that can, get you, it can build your repertoire of stories to tell.
And intentional approach is really important. And part of what I have to underline for people is that the stories, for you to own and retell the story, it doesn't need to be something that has happened to you personally. It can be a story that someone else in the organization has experienced and retold and has been captured. So I'm going to ask for Rebecca to do a couple of things and then ask you a final question. Rebecca, if you don't mind putting in chat the survey link for the audience to fill out later on, I would really appreciate that. Secondarily, want to mention, we barely touched the surface on some of these stories. I highly recommend, and I sincerely say this to all the executives I work with, I highly recommend Paul's books. And the 10 stories great leaders tell is one that I've gifted more than any other. It's really important to think about these stories, spend some time. And the more you look for it, the more likely you are to be able to come up with the stories and retell. So I've two closing questions, Paul. One is, one of the challenges I hear from leaders is, should I be retelling the same story? So when I have, whether it's the way I lead story, how often do I need to change stories or tell new stories? Would love for your thoughts on that. Then one final question after that, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah. So if your audience is changing, then of course you can tell the same story over and over and over again, and it'll always be new. if your audience is the same group of people, yeah, they probably don't want to hear the same story over and over again. It's going to lose its impact, which is why you need a large and growing repertoire of stories to tell. But if you're talking to the the new hires this year, yeah, you can tell them the same story you told the new hires last year because it's all new people. But you need to continue to grow your repertoire of stories to tell.
And would love to for us to visualize the importance of storytelling. You share this in your book. Would love to end with the significant objects experiments and the value that stories really bring to us, because sometimes people can't visualize how much more important it is to be able to tell stories rather than just communicate the way most of us typically communicate.
Yeah, so that was a fascinating experiment. I think it was Josh Walker, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but they went around to flea markets and garage sales, and they bought 100 items. I mean, just it was just junk, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing you find in garage sales, right? They spent, I think, a total of $129 buying 100. So it's like $1.29 on average each. These are 50-cent, 75-cent items, whatever. And then they sold them on eBay. Okay, one at a time. So the 100 postings on eBay to sell, a nutcracker, an old ashtray, whatever, coffee cup. But on, typically on eBay, you've got a title of the thing for sale and then a paragraph description and a picture. Well, they had the picture, but instead of the description, they told a story. And they actually hired people to write stories about these, and they made it clear in the stories that these are just completely fictional stories. There's nothing true about these stories at all. These are just fictional stories about this item. And they ended up selling these things for a total of, I think, $3,000 and something dollars. So multiple 100% increase in value. And the reason has to be the stories, and because it was the only thing that was different. And I think the conclusion that they drew from it is that stories are valuable, because in fact, it was unclear to them at the end of the experiment whether people were buying the item because it had an interesting story attached to it, or if they were buying the story because it had an item attached to it. And it didn't matter because they were getting both, right? This is now their story that they have with this item. And so that was their way to show, or that's how they learned that stories are really valuable to people, and people are actually willing to spend more money on things that have an interesting story behind them.
It's a powerful example and powerful story, and a challenge I throw down to all the LGW leaders. Think through the 10 stories that Paul talks about and think about a story or two for each one of those. And as you tell those stories, you will see a significant impact in your communication. And bringing people along, which is really critical in leadership. So Paul Smith, we really appreciate having you share your thoughts and insights with the Leadership Greater Washington community. Thank you so much for joining this.
You bet. Thanks for having me on. This was fun.